My cousin stole my identity to take out a $15,000 loan, using my social security card while staying in my apartment. When I told her it was a felony, she laughed and said, "Oh please, it's not like you're pressing charges. Family doesn't do that to each other." I stayed silent. That was 18 months ago. This morning, she was standing in court in handcuffs, crying my name. My cousin stole my identity to get a loan, and she thought I wouldn't press charges because we're family. Now she's crying because she's facing jail time. I never thought I'd be the kind of person who'd send my own cousin to prison. But when someone spends years wrecking your life for their own amusement, there comes a point where you stop playing nice. That someone is Claire. She's my aunt's daughter, and she's been a professional nightmare since the moment she learned how to talk. When we were little, Claire's favorite game was, how can I get Emily, me, in trouble? She'd wait until no one was looking, shove me hard enough to make me cry, and then yell, "She hit me!" Cue the adults rushing in, scolding me, and Claire standing there with fake tears dripping down her cheeks. At age 9, she destroyed my favorite porcelain doll, a gift from my late grandmother, and then told my mom she accidentally found it already broken, under my bed. The truth? I'd seen her smirk when she yanked it off my shelf and smashed it on the floor. By middle school, Claire had discovered the joy of public humiliation. She told people I stuffed my bra. I didn't. Wore cheap knockoff shoes. Also not true. And that I'd once peed my pants during a sleepover. Definitely not true. She'd phrase it like she was worried about me, which somehow made it worse. High school? That was when she started stealing. Not just little things. She took my hoodie, my favorite necklace, even the brand new makeup my mom bought me for prom, and if I dared to ask for it back, she'd look me dead in the eye and say, "You must have lost it." Then there was the Christmas she borrowed my iPod for a party. When she gave it back, it was scratched to hell, smelled like beer, and half my songs were deleted. She shrugged and said, "You should be thanking me. I cleaned up your playlist." By the time we were adults, Claire's behavior was basically part of the family wallpaper. She'd joke about me at dinners. "Careful everyone, she's been quiet for 5 minutes, she's probably plotting something." Or, "She only got promoted because she's pretty, not because she's smart." If anyone called her out, she'd laugh and say, "Oh my god, I'm just teasing. Don't be so sensitive." The final straw came last year. I started getting letters from a bank I didn't recognize congratulating me on my new loan. At first I thought it was a scam, so I ignored it. Then came a letter about a missed payment. Then a call from collections saying I owed $15,000. I told them they had the wrong person, but then they read off my full name, birthday, and social security number. I pulled my credit report. There it was. A personal loan taken out in my name, deposited into an account I didn't recognize. The bank asked if anyone close to me could have had access to my personal documents. That's when I remembered. 6 months earlier, Claire had stayed at my apartment for a week because her apartment was being fumigated. She had free run of my place, and my filing cabinet, where I kept my passport, social security card, and birth certificate, was right there in my office. I wanted to believe it wasn't her, until I saw the name on the account that got the money. Claire M., last name. I called her, keeping my voice steady. "Did you take out a loan in my name?" She laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Oh my god, don't be so dramatic. I just needed some quick cash and you weren't using your credit." I was stunned. She kept going. "Relax, I'll pay it off before anyone notices. You're fine." I told her it was a felony. She said, "Oh please, it's not like you're pressing charges. Family doesn't do that to each other." She miscalculated. I called the detective handling my case and gave him everything. The bank statements, screenshots of texts, and a recording of her laughing about it. Thank you, single-party consent laws. When Claire realized I wasn't going to protect her, she went nuclear. She showed up at my apartment screaming that I was destroying her life over a little mistake. When I didn't answer, she slid a note under the door. "Please don't do this. Think of the family. You know I'll make it right." The bank pressed charges. She was arrested for fraud and identity theft. She made bail and immediately started spinning the story. "She's overreacting. It's not that serious." Some relatives even sided with her, saying, "Couldn't you just let her pay you back?" She didn't borrow money. She risked my financial stability, my career, and my future. In court, she cried and tried to paint herself as clueless. She said that she didn't understand it was wrong. The prosecutor dismantled her defense with evidence, the account details, the recordings, and proof she had literally Googled how to take out a loan in someone else's name the week she stayed with me. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, and we were both shocked by their decision. "Guilty on all counts," the foreman said, and Claire's legs gave out so fast that the bailiff had to catch her. The judge set sentencing for 6 weeks out and denied her request to remain free on bail. They cuffed her right there in the courtroom while Aunt screamed that this was all my fault. 3 weeks later, Detective Torres called while I was making dinner. He'd found 2 more loans Claire had taken out using my middle name and a fake address. The total was now $35,000 and climbing. He needed me to come down to the station to look at more forged documents. I spent 4 hours going through paperwork, my signature copied so many times I started doubting my own handwriting. The next week, I found myself parked outside our childhood home at 2 in the morning. The Christmas lights were still up, even though it was March. I remembered the year Claire got the bike she wanted, plus a laptop while I got one sweater. She'd spent the whole day telling everyone I was greedy for wanting the art set I'd asked for. 4 weeks after the verdict, I had to go to Great Uncle Robert's funeral. Derek cornered me in the parking lot before I could even get inside. His kids were asking why mommy was in jail and what was he supposed to tell them. I told him to tell them the truth, that their mother stole money. He shoved past me so hard I stumbled into a car. That weekend, Brian's parents invited us to dinner at their place. His mother kept refilling my wine glass and finally mentioned they'd frozen their credit just to be safe. His father, who'd been a cop for 30 years, offered to install security cameras at our apartment for free. He'd seen too many cases where family members escalated after conviction. The next day, I ran into Mrs. De Patterson at the grocery store while buying frozen dinners. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like vanilla extract and whispered that she wasn't surprised about Claire. 15 years ago, she'd caught Claire stealing $20 from her purse during a barbecue. She hadn't said anything because she didn't want to cause family drama, but she'd never invited Claire back. 5 weeks after the verdict, Ryan Wilson filed a motion for a new trial. He claimed I'd manipulated evidence and conspired with prosecutors to frame Claire. Ada Rodriguez called me that afternoon and said it was desperation, that judges almost never granted these motions, but I'd need to be ready to testify again if somehow it went through. That same week, Tom reached out through Facebook Messenger. He'd been documenting everything Claire had done to him for years. $8,000 in fraudulent charges on credit cards she'd opened in his name. Screenshots of texts where she bragged about knowing how to work the system. He wanted to testify at her sentencing to show the pattern. The night before sentencing, I sat at my kitchen table table trying to write my victim impact statement. I wrote 12 different versions, each one angrier than the last. Brian read the final version while I paced around the apartment. He set it down and said I was still protecting the family by leaving out half of what she'd done, but I couldn't bring myself to add more. Sentencing day came too fast and too slow at the same time. Claire shuffled into court in an orange jumpsuit that hung off her frame. She'd lost at least 20 pounds, and her roots were showing 3 inches of brown under the blonde. She stood to read her statement, looking straight at me the whole time. She blamed everything on depression and family pressure to succeed, said she'd been trying to keep up with expectations that were impossible to meet. Aunt sobbed so loud the judge had to ask her to quiet down twice. When it was my turn to read my statement, my hands shook so bad I could barely hold the paper. I talked about 18 months of destroyed credit and sleepless nights. I mentioned the $47,000 this had cost me in legal fees and lost wages and credit repair. Claire jumped up and screamed that I was lying about the amount. The judge banged his gavel and threatened her with contempt if she interrupted again. The prosecutor called Tom to the stand next, and my stomach dropped because I had no idea Claire had other victims. Tom was this guy from her gym who she'd dated for maybe 3 months last year. He pulled out his phone and showed the court screenshots of bank transfers she'd made from his account to hers while he was sleeping. The total was almost $8,000 over 6 weeks. Ryan kept jumping up to object, but the judge waved him down and said this showed a clear pattern of behavior. Claire was shaking her head so hard her hair was flying everywhere, and she kept mouthing the word liar at Tom over and over. When it came time for sentencing 2 days later, the whole courtroom was packed with people from both sides of the family. The judge looked straight at Claire and said 3 to 5 years in state prison, plus full restitution of $47,000 to me. Claire really thought she'd get away with this just because they're related? The way she laughed when Emily confronted her about the loan makes me wonder if she's done this before to other people and never faced consequences. He also added 3 years of probation after her release. Aunt Margaret actually collapsed onto the floor and started screaming that I'd killed her daughter. The court officers had to help her to a bench while she kept wailing. Claire turned to stare at me as the deputies put the cuffs on her, and the look in her eyes was pure hatred. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters shoved microphones in my face asking how it felt to send family to prison. I couldn't speak, but Brian stepped forward and told them, "Justice doesn't stop being justice because you share DNA with the criminal." That quote ended up on the evening news, and my phone blew up with texts from people who'd seen it. A week later, my boss called me into her office and promoted me to the position I should have gotten 18 months ago. She handed me paperwork showing they were giving me back pay for the whole time too. She admitted they'd been waiting to see how the trial ended before committing to any leadership changes. That same afternoon, Derek sent me an email with photos of Claire's kids attached. The subject line just said, "Hope you're happy." In one photo, the youngest was holding up a sign for school that said, "My hero is my mom." I forwarded the whole thing to Dr. Patel to talk about at our next session. 2 weeks after the sentencing, I went to my credit union to close out some old accounts. The manager came out personally to apologize for not believing my identity theft claim at first. He offered me a settlement check for their delayed response to my fraud report. I realized Claire's conviction had completely changed how these institutions saw me now. I wasn't a potential liar anymore, but a verified victim with a court case to prove it. During lunch with my coworkers the next day, I heard 2 of them talking about whether they'd ever prosecute family. One was saying blood is thicker than water, and the other shot back that fraud is fraud no matter who does it. They both went quiet when they noticed me walking past their table. That evening at Dr. Patel's office, she pointed at the dark circles under my eyes and asked when I'd last gotten a full night's sleep. She wrote something in her notebook about my weight loss and asked if I was punishing myself for Claire's sentence. I admitted I kept having dreams about her kids visiting her in prison and crying at the glass partition. 3 weeks after the sentencing, a package arrived at my work addressed to me with no return label. Inside were dozens of family photos from holidays and birthdays and reunions. Every single photo had me cut out of it with scissors, leaving these jagged holes where I used to be. Security pulled the footage and saw Aunt Margaret in the parking garage that morning. They banned her from the building and added her photo to the security desk. Brian's sister called me that weekend to mention she'd made a report to Child Services. She'd seen Derek's kids posting on social media calling me Aunt Emily the Snitch and other worse names. She was worried about what they were being told at home about the whole situation. 10 weeks after Claire's sentencing, I walked into my lawyer's office with a stack of papers thick enough to use as a doorstop. The civil suit paperwork took 3 hours to complete, listing every single way Claire had damaged my life beyond just the money she stole. My lawyer filed it that afternoon, and within 2 days, Claire's prison commissary account got frozen since she couldn't have any assets while being sued. The prison told her she could only call her lawyer now. No more weekly calls to family members begging them to put money on her books. Aunt Margaret found out when Claire couldn't call her anymore and left me 43 voicemails in one night, each one getting louder and more unhinged than the last. The next morning, 3 different people reached out to me through Facebook after local news picked up the story about the civil suit. All 3 had worked with Claire at different jobs over the past 5 years, and each one had stories that made my skin crawl. One woman said Claire had forged her signature on a company credit card application and racked up $2,000 in charges before the woman caught it. Another said expensive equipment kept disappearing from their office, always items Claire had been the last to handle, but she always had perfect explanations about other people moving things. The third person sent screenshots of Claire selling designer purses on a Facebook marketplace group, using photos that looked exactly like items that had gone missing from their workplace break room. They all agreed to write sworn statements for my case, and my lawyer said their testimony would help prove a pattern of behavior. 3 months after sentencing, Brian made dinner at my apartment, just pasta and salad, nothing fancy. He kept fidgeting with something in his pocket while we ate, then suddenly got down on one knee right there in my tiny kitchen. He said he'd never seen anyone fight so hard for what was right, and if I could survive Claire, marriage would be easy by comparison. I said yes immediately, but we decided not to tell anyone except my mom for a week because I didn't want the family drama to ruin this moment. The next morning, I got a call from the private investigator I'd hired to dig deeper into Claire's finances. He'd found something that made my coffee go cold in my hands. Claire had been taking photos from my social media for years and listing items on eBay as if they were hers to sell. My designer sunglasses from a beach trip, a leather jacket from my birthday dinner photos, even jewelry I'd worn to weddings. The buyers confirmed they'd sent payments to accounts with variations of my name, like S. Johnson or Emily J. Payments, accounts Claire had apparently opened using my information. again. The investigator had screenshots of over 50 listings spanning 3 years, all using my photos, all claiming to be selling items I still owned. Meanwhile, Derek's lawsuit against me for defamation and emotional distress finally went before a judge after months of delays. The judge took one look at the evidence, including Derek's own text messages threatening me and calling me names I won't repeat, and dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning he could never file it again. The judge also ordered Derek to pay my legal fees, almost $8,000. Derek completely lost it in the courtroom, screaming that I was destroying innocent children and that his kids would suffer because of me. He kicked the courtroom door so hard that security had to physically escort him out while he kept yelling about how this wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I had to attend my cousin Victoria's wedding, and the seating chart had me at the cousin's table in the back corner, as far from the main family tables as possible. Everyone at my table acted like I was invisible, turning their backs when I sat down, moving their chairs away from me, not even making eye contact. Victoria found me during the reception and apologized with tears in her eyes, saying Aunt Margaret had threatened not to come at all if I was treated like family. She said she was sorry, but she couldn't risk her mom ruining her wedding day. I left after dinner without saying goodbye to anyone. The one bright spot came when Brian and I went apartment hunting the next week, and my credit report finally showed my score had recovered to where it was before Claire's theft. The notification popped up on my phone while we were touring a 2-bedroom place with actual closet space and a dishwasher. The property manager ran my application right there and approved it without asking a single question or requiring extra documentation. For the first time in over a year, my credit wasn't a red flag that needed explaining. A month later, Claire's lawyer sent a settlement offer for the civil suit through my attorney. She would admit in writing to everything she'd done, provide a full accounting of all the money she'd stolen over the years, and agree to pay restitution if I dropped the civil case. Ada Rodriguez called me immediately when she heard about the offer, warning that if Claire admitted guilt in writing for the civil case, it could affect her ability to appeal the criminal conviction. She strongly suggested I refuse the settlement and let both cases proceed separately. I turned down the offer that same day. During my therapy session that week, Dr. Patel pointed out something I hadn't noticed myself. She said I'd stopped apologizing for taking up space in our sessions, stopped asking if it was okay to talk about certain topics, stopped prefacing every statement with disclaimers. She told me I wasn't asking permission to exist anymore. And that's when it hit me that Claire had trained me my whole life to be small and quiet and apologetic. Every cruel joke, every public humiliation, every theft had been designed to make me feel like I deserved less space in the world. The private investigator called me the next morning with news that made me sit down hard on my kitchen floor. He'd found a bank account Claire had opened in her daughter's name 2 years ago, with over $50,000 deposited in small increments. The screenshots showed transfers that matched dates when various family members had reported thefts or missing money over the years. Claire had been crying poverty to everyone, claiming she could barely feed her kids, while sitting on a secret stash of stolen money that could have paid for college tuition. The detective said this discovery changed everything, and suggested I start putting together a complete timeline of Claire's thefts going back as far as I could remember. Brian came over that weekend with his laptop, and we spent 12 hours straight going through every old email, text, and family photo I had saved. We made a spreadsheet with dates, amounts stolen, victims' names, and any proof we could find like old bank statements or receipts. Claire's playing financial hide-and-seek with $50,000 in her kid's name while crying poor to everyone. That's like robbing a bank then asking for spare change outside. The nerve takes real talent. By Sunday night, we had over 200 entries dating back 20 years with red flags marking the worst ones. My lawyer took one look at the visual chart Brian created and said it was the most damning pattern of behavior she'd ever seen documented. 3 weeks later, Mom called asking if I could help her clean out Grandma's house since the realtor wanted it empty for showings. We were going through Grandma's bedroom closet when Mom found an old shoebox tucked behind some winter coats. Inside was $5,000 in cash wrapped in rubber bands with a note in Grandma's shaky handwriting that said, "For Emily, hide it from Claire." The date on the note was 3 months before Grandma died, which meant even on her deathbed she was trying to protect me from my cousin. Mom started crying when she read it and handed me the money, saying Grandma would want me to have it after everything I'd been through. A month after that, a reporter from the local news station called saying they were doing a special report on family fraud and identity theft. She'd heard about my case from someone at the courthouse and wondered if I'd be willing to share my story to help other victims. I agreed, but only if they kept my face hidden and changed my voice since I didn't want more drama from the family. The interview took 3 hours at the TV station with me sitting in shadow while I explained how Claire had stolen from me for decades. The reporter kept shaking her head, saying in 15 years of journalism, she'd never seen someone document fraud so thoroughly. Meanwhile, things were getting worse with Aunt Margaret, who was now trying to pull Claire's kids out of school. She filed paperwork claiming the school district was persecuting her grandchildren because of their mother's situation. The principal called child services when Aunt showed up screaming that the teachers were turning the kids against their family. CPS started doing welfare checks at Aunt's house where the kids were staying, which made Derek furious. He left me a voicemail saying I was destroying innocent children's lives and that I should be ashamed of myself for what I'd started. After the news special aired, my phone started ringing nonstop with people who recognized details from my story. 5 different people reached out saying Claire had stolen from them too, including her high school best friend Amy. Amy told me Claire had taken $3,000 from her wedding fund, but she never reported it because who would believe her over Claire? We started an email chain to share our stories and compare notes about Claire's methods over the years. More people kept joining, including Claire's old roommate from college and 2 former co-workers from different jobs. Then came the call I'd been dreading when Claire's lawyer told me her appeal had been denied by the judge. Claire called me from prison that same day, not knowing my phone was set to record all unknown numbers automatically. She was crying at first, but then her voice got cold and she said when she got out she'd make sure I never felt safe again. She said I'd ruined her life over money that didn't even matter, and that I'd regret turning my back on family. I forwarded the recording to the detective and the prosecutor, who said they'd add it to her file for threatening a witness. Our victim support group decided to meet in person at a coffee shop downtown 2 weeks later. 12 people showed up with folders full of evidence and stories about Claire that made my skin crawl. We calculated that between all of us, Claire had stolen over $200,000 through various schemes over 15 years. A lawyer in the group suggested we file a class action civil suit to try recovering damages from any assets Claire might have hidden. Everyone agreed it was worth worth trying, even if we never saw a penny, since it would create a public record of her crimes. Brian and I had been looking at houses in different suburbs trying to get away from all the family drama. We finally closed on a small place about 40 minutes from my old apartment where nobody knew our story. While packing up my things, I found a birthday card Claire had given me the previous year with a butterfly on the front. Inside, she'd written, "Family is everything. Love you forever, cousin," in her perfect handwriting with little hearts drawn around the edges. I decided to frame it as a reminder of how good she was at pretending to care while stabbing you in the back. That's when Derek's wife Jennifer called me out of the blue saying she needed to talk to me urgently. She was filing for divorce and wanted to apologize for not speaking up sooner about what she knew. She told me Derek had known about Claire's schemes for years and had actually been getting a cut of the money. Jennifer had screenshots of texts between Derek and Claire discussing percentages and payment schedules going back 5 years. She'd also found deposits in their joint account that matched dates when family members reported thefts, which Derek had explained away as bonuses from work. The next morning, my company's legal department contacted me after hearing about the case from someone who saw the news story. They wanted to offer pro bono assistance with the civil suit since they saw it as a chance to set precedent for identity theft victims. The head lawyer said corporate identity theft was becoming a huge problem, and a well-documented case like mine could help change how these crimes were prosecuted. 25 weeks after Claire got sentenced, I was sitting at my desk when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The woman on the other end said she was Agent Patricia Campbell from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My stomach dropped until she explained they weren't calling about me. They'd found Claire's name connected to unreported income from the accounts she'd hidden during the divorce. Agent Campbell said the tax fraud charges alone could add another 5 to 7 years to her sentence. She asked if I had any documents from the identity theft case that might help their investigation. I spent the next 3 hours forwarding everything I had while she took notes about dates and amounts. That same week, my phone buzzed with an Instagram message from someone named Madison. The profile picture showed a teenage girl who looked exactly like Claire at that age. Madison wrote that she was Claire's oldest daughter, and she needed to know if everything people were saying about her mom was true. I stared at the message for 20 minutes before typing back that she should ask her dad for the truth. 5 minutes later, she replied that she already knew because she'd found a box of papers her dad had hidden in the garage. She'd seen the fake documents, the forged signatures, everything. She said she'd been keeping it secret for months, but couldn't anymore. 2 days later, Brian and I were looking at wedding venues when the planner asked about our guest list. I realized I only had mom to invite from my side while Brian had 63 relatives coming. His grandmother Martha overheard and pulled me aside. She grabbed my hands and said, "Real family is chosen, not born," and they'd already chosen me. Brian's mom started crying and said they'd been hoping I'd let them adopt me for the wedding day. His dad joked that he'd already been practicing his father of the bride's scowl for the photos. The class action lawsuit got filed the next month with 17 people who'd been scammed by Claire over the years. The total damages came to over $400,000. The court immediately froze the account where Claire had hidden money from Derek. Aunt went on the local news that night calling us vultures feeding on her daughter's misfortune. She wore all black like she was already in mourning and dabbed at her eyes even though no tears came. The reporter asked if she thought Claire was guilty, and Aunt said we'd all turned against family for money. Mom threw a shoe at the TV and broke the screen. My therapist, Dr. Patel, had been seeing me weekly since the trial started. At our session after the lawsuit news broke, she smiled and said I'd made enough progress to move to monthly appointments. She said I'd reclaimed my narrative and wasn't defining myself by what Claire did anymore. I hadn't even noticed, but she was right. I'd stop checking over my shoulder when I walked to my car. I'd stop jumping when unknown numbers called. Derek got arrested 2 weeks later when his ex-wife gave police evidence that he'd helped Claire with the fraud. He called me from jail sobbing that I'd destroyed 2 families now. His voice cracked when he said his kids would grow up without a father because of me. I hung up without saying anything and realized I felt nothing at all. Not guilt, not satisfaction, just nothing. Madison sent me a letter the next week that she'd written to her mom but never sent. She described years of lies and manipulation, how her mom would play her and her siblings against each other. She'd been in therapy since the arrest trying to understand why her mom was the way she was. At the bottom, she wrote, "Thank you for stopping the cycle before it destroyed us too." I ran into Tom at a coffee shop downtown 8 months after the sentencing. He was with a pretty brunette who smiled and shook my hand. He looked healthier than I'd seen him in years. We didn't mention Claire until he was leaving, and he turned back to say thank you for being the one who finally stopped her. He said testifying had been cathartic and he'd been able to move on. 2 days later, I was making dinner when Brian's phone rang. It was the prison calling to say Claire had attempted suicide and was in the medical wing. She'd swallowed a bottle of pills she'd been hoarding. Aunt left me 43 voicemails over the next 6 hours. Mom intercepted me before I could listen to them all. She drove me straight to Brian's parents' house where his dad made me tea while his mom deleted the messages. Madison reaching out to verify the truth about her mom makes me wonder what else she discovered in that box of papers Derek hid. Finding evidence against your own parent must be hitting her hard right now. Aunt's last one said if Claire died, my blood would be on her hands forever. Brian's dad, who'd been a cop for 30 years, sat with me that night and said Aunt was grieving and looking for someone to blame. We'd just moved into our new house the next month when I asked Brian's dad to run a background check on our neighbors. I couldn't help it after everything that happened. He came back the next day and said they were clean, just a normal family with 2 kids and a dog. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and said I'd always be looking over my shoulder. But that wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom after what I'd been through. 8 months passed before I got the call that changed everything again. The detective's voice was flat when he told me Claire had tried to kill herself in prison by swallowing a bottle of cleaning solution she'd stolen from the janitor's cart. She survived but barely, and they moved her to the psychiatric ward where her lawyer Ryan immediately filed for compassionate release. The paperwork landed on my desk 2 days later with a psychiatrist's note claiming I'd pushed for vindictive prosecution that caused her mental breakdown. I threw the papers in the trash and called the prosecutor who said they'd fight it but warned me these things sometimes worked. While we waited for that hearing, the IRS investigator Brian's dad had connected me with finally finished their audit of Claire's finances. She'd been filing fake tax returns for 5 years straight, claiming kids that didn't exist and businesses she never ran. The federal prosecutor added 15 more years worth of charges to her case. I was reading through the new indictment at my kitchen table when someone knocked on my door. A teenage girl stood there holding a cardboard box, and it took me a second to recognize Claire's daughter from the the few family photos I'd seen. She shoved the box at me without saying hello and told me these were her mom's journals from the past 15 years. Every scam, every victim, every person she'd ever screwed over was documented in Claire's own handwriting. The girl turned to leave but stopped and said I needed them more than she did, then walked away before I could respond. I spent the next 3 days reading through page after page of Claire's plans to destroy people's lives, including detailed notes about how she'd targeted me specifically because she knew I wouldn't fight back. 2 weeks later was my bridal shower, and Mom had rented out a whole restaurant for it. None of my aunts or cousins showed up, not even a card or text message. Brian's family filled every seat instead, and his aunt pulled me aside to tell me I'd learned early what most people figure out too late, that family isn't about blood. The local news picked up the story the next week when someone leaked recordings from the prison of Claire, teaching other inmates how to steal identities and commit fraud. She'd been running classes 3 times a week, complete with homework assignments she graded. The authorities added racketeering charges on top of everything else. That same month, the victim support group's lawyer called to say they'd won the class action lawsuit against Claire. Her hidden assets got split between all the victims, and my check came to $67,000, way more than she'd ever stolen from me when you added in the damages. I deposited it the same day Aunt got arrested at her job for trying to bribe Tom, one of the other victims, to change his testimony. The security cameras at his workplace caught her sliding an envelope full of cash across his desk while begging him to help save her daughter. Even she couldn't escape the mess Claire had created. A week before my wedding, Claire's ex-husband showed up at my apartment with an envelope containing $10,000 in cashier's checks. He'd been in therapy for months and wanted to make things right for the money Claire stole from their joint accounts that he never reported. He apologized for not warning me about her sooner and left without asking for forgiveness. The federal prosecutor called that night with news that they'd offered Claire a plea deal for 25 years total if she'd identify all her victims and pay full restitution. She refused, claiming she was innocent of everything, so they set a trial date for the following spring. My wedding day came faster than expected, and as Mom walked me down the aisle since Dad had passed years ago, I looked at all the faces there to support me. Not one person from Claire's side of the family showed up, but I didn't feel the loss anymore, just freedom. Brian's vows included a promise to help guard the life I'd fought to rebuild, and when he said it, I saw Detective Torres nodding from the 3rd row where he'd come as a guest. The reception flew by in a blur of cake cutting and first dances until the bouquet toss came around. I watched from the side as all the single women gathered behind me, but when I threw the flowers over my shoulder, they sailed past everyone straight to a teenage girl standing at the edge. Claire's daughter caught them without even trying, and when she walked over to hug me, she leaned close and said she was going to law school to help victims like us. The way she held those flowers tight against her chest made my eyes burn with tears I didn't expect. 3 days later, in our Hawaii hotel room, I was spreading sunscreen on my shoulders when my phone rang with a Minnesota number. The federal prosecutor's voice crackled through the speaker telling me Claire had fired Ryan Wilson and decided to represent herself at the federal trial. She'd filed paperwork claiming I was the mastermind who framed her and subpoenaed me as a witness for her defense. Brian grabbed the phone from my shaking hand while I sat on the bed trying to process this new insanity. The prosecutor called back an hour later on a conference call with a whole legal team, explaining Claire's self-representation was basically legal suicide. They said her subpoena would get thrown out since I was already a witness for the prosecution. Brian canceled our snorkeling trip so I could spend 3 hours going over testimony prep with the lawyers. 13 months after her state sentencing, I walked into the federal courthouse wearing the same black suit from my wedding. Claire sat at the defense table in a borrowed gray suit that hung loose on her thin frame. She'd lost at least 30 pounds in prison, and her hair had gone completely gray at the roots. When she stood for her opening statement, she pointed at me and rambled about inheritance money I supposedly wanted. The jury kept looking at each other with confused expressions while she talked about conspiracy theories involving Detective Torres and the bank. I took the stand the next morning and testified for 6 straight hours while Claire interrupted with objections every few minutes. She called me a pathological liar 7 different times until the judge threatened her with contempt charges. When the prosecutor handed me the evidence binder, Claire actually helped prove my case by demanding to see specific documents. She kept asking about dates that matched exactly when she'd stayed at my apartment. Her own questions showed the jury how she knew where I kept my personal documents. On the 3rd day, the prosecutor called Claire's daughter to testify about thefts in their own house. The girl walked past her mother without looking and took the oath with steady hands. She told the court about missing birthday money, forged checks from her college fund, and credit cards opened in her name. Claire jumped up screaming that she gave her life, and the judge ordered the bailiffs to remove her. They dragged her out while she screamed my name over and over like I was the one who'd betrayed her. The closing arguments happened over video link since Claire wasn't allowed back in the courtroom. She admitted to borrowing money but insisted everyone was overreacting about a family matter. She actually looked into the camera and said it wasn't like she killed anyone. The prosecutor stood up and responded that she'd killed trust, futures, and family bonds. The jury left to deliberate and came back in exactly 30 minutes with guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Combined with her state sentence, the judge calculated she'd serve between 28 and 35 years. Aunt Margaret fainted in the gallery when she heard Claire would be in her 70s before release. The sentencing happened 2 weeks later with Claire back in the courtroom in shackles. The judge called her a predator who weaponized family trust against the people who loved her most. Claire turned to me and screamed that I'd won and asked if I was happy now. I sat there realizing I wasn't happy or sad or angry anymore, just free from her shadow. Outside the courthouse, reporters shoved microphones at me asking for statements about the verdict. I looked straight at the cameras and said, "Family isn't a license to destroy someone's life, and justice doesn't care about DNA." The victim support group formed a circle around me, blocking the cameras while we walked to our cars together. 2 weeks after the federal trial wrapped up, Derek sat in another courtroom pleading guilty to conspiracy charges while his lawyer negotiated for probation instead of jail time. The judge gave him 2 years probation and ordered him to pay back every penny he'd helped Claire steal from the other victims. I watched from the back row as they led him out in handcuffs for processing, and my phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife saying she'd finally found the courage to leave him after seeing me stand up to Claire. The next morning, Mom picked me up early, and we drove to the cemetery where Grandma was buried 20 years ago. I knelt down and placed the newspaper clipping about Claire's conviction against the headstone, while Mom stood behind me with her hand on my shoulder. Claire's daughter showing up with a box of her mom's criminal playbook journals is peak. My mom's terrible, but here's the evidence energy. Talk about choosing justice over blood ties with style. She said Grandma would have been proud that someone finally broke the family pattern of looking the other way when people hurt each other. We both cried standing there in the cold November wind, thinking about all the years Grandma had to watch her own sister steal from her while everyone pretended it wasn't happening. Brian and I hosted our first Thanksgiving at our new apartment, and his parents brought enough food for 20 people even though it was just the 6 of us. Claire's daughter came with her dad and his new girlfriend, helping me set the table while Brian's mom taught her how to make proper gravy from scratch. While we were washing dishes later, she looked at me and said, "This was what family was supposed to feel like, not walking on eggshells waiting for the next explosion." 6 months after the federal trial ended, I got a letter from Claire at the Women's Correctional Facility asking for money for her commissary account because the food was terrible and she needed better shampoo. Not one word of apology, not one acknowledgement of what she'd done, just a list of what she wanted me to buy her and instructions on how to add money to her account. I framed that letter right next to the birthday card she'd sent me years ago, where she'd written, "Family helps family," and hung them both on my office wall as a reminder of who she really was, underneath all the tears and manipulation. The victim support group met every Tuesday at the community center, and we spent 3 months putting together a guide for other identity theft survivors based on everything we'd learned. We published it online for free, and within 6 weeks, 43 people had contacted us saying it helped them navigate their own cases against family members who'd stolen from them. Claire's legacy ended up being that her victims learned how to help other victims fight back against their own Claires. My promotion celebration happened at a downtown restaurant with my new team, none of whom knew anything about the trial or Claire or any of the drama from the past 2 years. Brian watched me introduce myself to the new junior analyst without automatically checking my wallet was still in my purse, something I'd done constantly since finding out about the identity theft. He mentioned later it was the first time he'd seen me completely relaxed around new people since everything started. Claire's daughter graduated as valedictorian the following spring, and I sat in the auditorium listening to her speech about learning that real strength meant stopping cycles of harm, even when it cost you everything you thought you knew about family. She looked right at me when she said that part and mouthed thank you, before continuing with her prepared remarks about college plans and future dreams. 2 years after that first guilty verdict, I was 7 months pregnant and organizing the nursery in our new house, while Brian assembled the crib his parents had bought us. I placed Grandma's photo on the shelf above the changing table, the only extended family picture we'd decided to display in the whole house. Brian found me later that evening writing in a leather journal I'd bought specifically to document everything that had happened with Claire for our child to read someday. I wanted them to understand why we chose our friends as family, why we always verified before trusting anyone with important documents, and why sometimes the most loving thing you could do for someone was hold them accountable for their actions instead of enabling them. The last line I wrote before closing the journal was that their cousin Claire had taught me that family isn't about blood or DNA or shared last names, but about who shows up for you without a hidden agenda, who celebrates your success without jealousy, and who loves you without conditions or manipulation. Well, this has definitely been quite the journey to share with you all, hasn't it? Thanks for letting me wonder about things right alongside you. Subscribe for more content like this.